What's up, guys? We are here with the 24th shelf of my wrestling collection. We start off with WCW Uncensored 2000. You got Sid Vicious versus Jeff Jarrett, which was an okay match, but not main event quality. You got the Harris Brothers versus the Mamalukes. Terry Funk versus Dustin Rhodes, which was kind of, Terry Funk was past his prime for sure. Sting versus Lex Luger in a lumberjack match. Lex Luger was past his prime at this point too. The Wall versus Bam Bam Bigelow, which was not good. WCW 2000 was, it was rough. Then we have Super Brawl 5. This is pre-NWO, 1995 WCW. Got Alex Wright versus Paul Roma. Wasn't the greatest match. Hacksaw Jim Duggan versus Bunkhouse Buck. Not that great either. Dave Sullivan and Kevin Sullivan, story-wise was good. Match-wise, not so good. Dustin Rhodes versus Blacktop Bully. That was actually a pretty good match. You got the Nasty Boys versus Harlem Heat. The two of those teams could tear the house down, and that was no exception right there. Then you got Sting and Randy Savage versus Big Bubba and Avalanche. You got to bring in Hulk Hogan's buddies. And then you've got Hulk Hogan versus Vader, which is, Vader was the big heel at the time for Hogan to squash, so they did, even though Vader was built up really well and they never used him properly after Hogan got there. Then we have Uncensored 1995. Bought this off eBay, so it didn't have the cover art from a rental store. But this was when the match between Blacktop Bully and Dustin Rhodes happened in the back of the semi-truck. And then this was also where the arena brawl between Harlem Heat and the Nasty Boys happened. So this was actually a pretty solid pay-per-view. And this is also where Ric Flair showed up dressed as a woman to attack Hulk Hogan. So then we have the Great American Bash 1995. You got Marcus Bagwell versus Craig Pittman. Don't really remember that match. Flying Brian Pillman and Alex Wright was good. Dave Sullivan versus Diamond Dallas Page was it was kind of ridiculous. Arn Anderson versus the Renegade. Even Arn Anderson says he couldn't polish that turd. And then there was the Nasty Boys versus the Blue Bloods. I liked the Blue Bloods as a tag team. Sting versus Ming was good. And then Randy Savage versus Flair was good. So all in all, a pretty solid pay-per-view. Then we've got World War III from 1995. You got this whole list of people in the match there. Not a lot of huge names. But then you've got Sting versus Ric Flair, which is always good. Lex Luger versus Randy Savage, which was actually a solid match. Kensuke Sasaki versus Chris Benoit. I honestly don't remember that match. Then you got Bull Nakano and Akira Hokuto versus Mayumi Uzaki and Cutie Suzuki. I mean, I'm sure that was something to do with their New Japan relationship that made them do that match. Then you got Big Bubba Rogers versus Jim Duggan. Horrible. Johnny B. Bad versus Diamond Dallas Page was a solid match. So it was an okay pay-per-view. I'm not a huge fan of these World War III pay-per-views, but they were looking for their answer to the Royal Rumble, and this was not it. Then we've got Starrcade 1995. Jushin Thunder Liger versus Chris Benoit was good. Kaji Kanimoto versus Alex Wright. I don't remember that. Masa Saito versus Lex Luger. Don't remember that. Shinjiro Utani versus Eddie Guerrero. And then Hiroshi Tenzan versus Macho Man Randy Savage. Then you've got the #1 contenders triple threat match to see who will face Randy Savage for the belt. Ric Flair, Lex Luger, and Sting. Obviously, Ric Flair won because he ended up facing the Macho Man that night. Wasn't the greatest Starrcade. Made it seem less than this as far as this international tournament deal. Then we've got Super Brawl 6 from 1996 now. Got Sting and Lex Luger versus Harlem Heat. I love the whole is Lex Luger with the Dungeon of Doom or is he not angle that they had going on. Then you got Hulk Hogan versus the Giant, which was an okay match. And then you got the Ric Flair versus Randy Savage, which is always a solid watch. Then we have Slamboree 1996. This was, I actually liked this pay-per-view with the Battle Bowl. I was kind of a fan of Battle Bowl. I kind of hope WWE would bring Battle Bowl back. That would be awesome. Conan versus Jushin Thunder Liger. Not very good. Dean Malenko and Brad Armstrong. Brad Armstrong was a good hand, so it was a solid match. The Giant versus Sting. Not so great. And then see, now you got Road Warrior Hawk and Total Package Lex Luger versus Road Warrior Animal and Booker T. You got Booty Man and Rick Steiner versus Sergeant Craig Pittman and Scott Steiner. Macho Man Randy Savage and Ric Flair versus Arn Anderson and Eddie Guerrero. Then you got the Taskmaster and Chris Benoit versus Public Enemy. So I mean, it was just kind of random, and I kind of liked, you know, the whole storylines that they could do with that. I know I was on the minority with that, obviously. Then we have the Great American Bash 1996. We got the Lord of the Ring match, the Cruiserweight title match. Yeah, it doesn't even say who it is. Chris Benoit versus Taskmaster, which, 96, they had a series of phenomenal matches. Conan versus El Gato, don't remember that. Kevin Green and Steve McMichael versus Ric Flair and Arn Anderson was good storyline-wise to get Steve McMichael to join the Horsemen, but the match itself was not good. And then finally you got Lex Luger versus the Giant. Turned his back on Jimmy Hart now and is finally a face. Not the greatest Great American Bash. This is also where Scott Hall and Kevin Nash showed up and powerbombed Eric Bischoff through the stage, and the NWO started. Next, we've got Bash at the Beach 96. Everyone knows this pay-per-view. This is where Hogan turned. But you got Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Psychosis, which is always a solid match. DDP versus Jim Duggan. The Nasty Boys versus Public Enemy, and they did not work well together. Dean Malenko versus Disco Inferno. You got Steve McMichael versus Joe Gomez. They're trying to get Steve McMichael to be a heel here. Conan versus Ric Flair. I know Ric Flair wasn't too happy about being in that match. You got the Giant and Kevin Sullivan versus Arn Anderson and Chris Benoit. And then you've got Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Hulk Hogan versus Lex Luger, Macho Man, and Sting. So the formation of the NWO is official on this pay-per-view. And you can tell they had their promo stuff, kind of had to turn it in ahead of time because he's still in his red and yellow, even though he's part of the NWO here for Hog Wild 96. Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Ultimo Dragon was amazing. Ric Flair versus Eddie Guerrero was amazing. Medusa versus Bull Nakano was not. Harlem Heat versus, that's a lot of managers there, versus the Steiner Brothers is always a solid match. Then you got Lex Luger and Sting versus the Outsiders, which was great for the NWO angle. And then you've got the Giant versus Hulk Hogan, which you kind of knew Hogan was going to win the belt at this point because they needed the momentum for the NWO. But solid pay-per-view. Then we've got Super Brawl 7 from 1997. Conan La Parka, Villano 4, Super Calo, Oh yeah, versus Super Calo, Juventud Guerrero, and Seco Play. Me. Dean Malenko versus Six was okay. The Outsiders versus the Giant Lex Luger was okay. Then Hulk Hogan versus Roddy Piper was a pretty solid match, considering Roddy Piper was kind of past his prime at this point. Then you got Chris Benoit versus Kevin Sullivan again. Again, they tore the house down all their matches. They were so intense. And then you got Steve McMichael versus Jeff Jarrett, because Jeff Jarrett's no longer a part of the Horsemen. Public Enemy versus the Faces of Fear versus Harlem Heat. Great tag team division here in WCW at this point. DDP versus Chris Jericho was solid. And Prince Iaukea versus Rey Mysterio Jr. was also solid. The undercard for WCW was amazing at this point. Then we have Uncensored 1998. You got Lex Luger versus Scott Steiner. And this is when Scott Steiner became, Big Papa Pump. Bret Hart versus Rick Rude. That must have been a typo, because Rick Rude didn't, I don't get that. I don't remember that. I think he was facing Kurt Hennig there. Yep, and then you got Diamond Dallas Page versus Raven versus Chris Benoit, which was an amazing match. Sting versus Scott Hall. Scott Hall had won World War III the year before and finally cashed in. You knew he wasn't going to win the belt, though, because it was going to be Hogan if anyone was going to win the belt again. Then you got Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, which is what put Randy Savage on the shelf. He was having knee problems and had knee surgery after this. But it did start the NWO Wolfpack after this as well. Then you've got Slamboree 1998, and this is where the Giant turned again to join the NWO again, which made no sense. But you got Ultimo Dragon and Eddie Guerrero, which was amazing. You got Raven versus DDP, which was great. Bill Goldberg and Saturn was actually a phenomenal match. Bret Hart versus Randy Savage, solid match. And Sting and the Giant versus the Outsiders was the main event. And, like I said, this is where, Scott Hall, betrays and joins the Giant, and they both are with NWO Hollywood, which leaves Kevin Nash and Sting on the outs. Weird way to end a pay-per-view. This is also the pay-per-view where Eric Bischoff kept challenging Vince McMahon to a match and to show up. So it was interesting. People were, wrestlers in the back were saying if it wasn't on pay-per-view, he might have actually shown up. Then you've got the Great American Bash 98. Got the Giant versus Sting for the belt. For the tag belts, anyway. Savage versus Piper. Hart and Hogan versus Savage and Piper. Goldberg versus Conan. Booker T versus Fit Finlay for the TV belt, which was a solid match. Chavo versus Eddie was a great match. Juventud Guerrero versus Reese was horrible. Dean Malenko versus Jericho, always solid. Saturn versus Canyon was good. Benoit versus Booker T. This is when they started their Best of 7 series, and those matches were phenomenal. And then finally we have Road Wild 1998. Got Scott Steiner versus Rick Steiner, which didn't really happen. Scott Steiner weaseled his way out of the match. You got Chavo Guerrero Jr. versus Stevie Ray. And this is when Stevie Ray was defending the TV belt for his brother, which was stupid. Great for storyline-wise, but they never went anywhere with it. Then you got Canyon versus Raven versus Saturn, which was a solid match. Chris Jericho versus Juventud, with Dean Malenko as the referee, was good. The Battle Royal was a joke. The Wolfpack versus NWO Black and White versus Goldberg. But I liked the Diamond Dallas Page and Jay Leno versus Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff. Great storyline-wise, had a lot of heat. But the fact that it's at a motorcycle rally where no one really cared, you couldn't really hear the noise that you would have heard in a regular arena for this match. So, it is what it is. But, yeah, that'll do it for this shelf. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe. Your support is much appreciated. I'm also on Letterboxd. The link is over in the profile of this page. Otherwise, until next time, guys.